Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Nothing Zilch Nada. We're your hosts, Xavier Dean,
And Jacob Green.
and today we're going to work on a segment called Master Debaters. Now, there are a lot of debates that Jake and I could do. Some of them more political, some of them more religious. Today, I feel like this is a debate that may rock our friendship up a little bit. And it has something to do with Disney.
Mm.
See, if we look at the history of Disney, for the longest time they worked on 2D animation. That was until Pixar came into the mix. They focused a little more on 3D animation, spending part of the time fusing 2D and 3D animation before inevitably coming together just to make 3D animated works. And I'm going to be honest, I feel like this is a topic of its own that we should talk about. So, Jake, today we're going to be debating what is the better animation style, 2D or 3D?
Yeah, I say on top of talking about movies, I think we could apply that same philosophy to games as I'm more in tune with the game world than I am with the movie world because I think while they do have differences in terms of the way that they're handled, at the end of the day, uh, they still have some of the same constructs to deal with. But
Mm-hmm.
we'll get to those when we get to those, but I think it's fair if we, talk about the movies first. And it's actually I was just thinking about Disney today because of what you were mentioning to me last night about, possibly doing this topic because it's like, Disney's thing for a while was making great 2D animated works.
Mm-hmm.
And their integration into doing 3D movies was kind of like, or 3D animation was kind of a slow integration if you think about it, because even some of their 2D animated works, particularly the ones that were from the 80s and 90s, had some 3D elements to it. Beauty to the Beast and Hunchback of Notre Dame as examples.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, because I'm a great host, Jake, which side do you prefer? Do you prefer 2D animation or do you prefer 3D?
Hmm. I think, you know what? I think I'll go with 3D.
You're gonna go 3D animation today?
Mhm.
All right, then I will stick with the good old classic 2D animation. So, again, because I'm a good host, Jake, I'll let you start with the arguments.
Okay, so applying how 3D animation would be better for movies. As I was mentioning already, Disney in particular, their 2D animated movies were slowly integrating 3D into the mix. What that does is that it provides a whole sense of realism and depth that you probably wouldn't be able to get in a 2D space, like a painting background or something like that. Um, and just to bring up some examples, Beauty and the Beast has like the ballroom scene where like you see Belle and the Beast dancing around and you could just see the room just like rotating around. And sure, it's still 2D art, but there's the room is like a completely 3D space to deal with. And then Hunchback of Notre Dame has some very fantastic 3D scenes where there's moments where like uh Quasimodo is just like going down like the little water chute, or he's ringing the bell, and it gives that sense of depth and real estate. And the church building too is just like that magnificent depth that you get from like the 3D space. But they are still primarily 2D movies at the end of the day. They just have a blend of 3D mixed in. But this was something that Disney was slowly trying to integrate.
Mhm.
I think if we were to talk about some 3D examples, and I'm actually going to mention one that's a movie and one that's a show, because you already mentioned Pixar, who are kind of the progenitors of this type of art style. Well, there is one other example that was a little bit earlier, but I'll get to it. But Toy Story, when that movie came out, I don't think that movie would be what it was if it wasn't 3D. I mean, sure, it could probably look good in 3D, but the thing is, it's just like the toys, the fact that like they were all 3D models, and the fact that like you could see the shine of the plastic and the depth of like, oh, these feel like real toys in real life. If you were to compare it to a real life model, you're like, yeah, this kind of looks like how it does in the movies. Um, and then the other thing to take into consideration too is, you know, there are more opportunities with facial expressions, which is something that 2D animators had to deal with, and there are some really great examples of that as well. But 3D animators were able to like squish and squash like they never could before. Toy Story was a big example, but the second example I'm going to mention, I think, was one of the best examples. Veggie Tales, and
Mhm.
yes, it's a TV show, but 3D animation was its thing. And what it did was it took the elements of 2D animation and applied it to the show. Like they applied like more squish and squash with the eyes, and the fact that like, you know, they were able to get more wacky and cartoony with it in the 3D space as compared to a 2D plane. Um, so I say my first argument after saying all that is that I think 3D animation just provides a lot more depth, like literal depth that you probably would be hard to pull off in a 2D space. It's not to say that you couldn't, but it's way harder to do it in a 2D plane than it is with 3D.
All right. So I will agree to some extent that 3D animation has a bigger depth. You know, like you mentioned for Toy Story with their like the shine of the plastics, providing that. However, when it comes to facial expressions, I feel like 2D animation still has a little more of an advantage because the problem with 3D is because 3D animation gives us that third dimension, we have to follow within the realms of 3D. So yeah, you could have someone, you know, with a shocked expression open their mouth, but the extent of that open mouth is the same extent as our open mouths. If we take, for example, the Aladdin, because this happened with 2D animation, you can get away with someone literally having their jaws drop to the floor and it still look pristine, it still look good. Whereas in 3D animation, you have that same effect happen. It looks ugly because now you're rendering an extra model that would look out of place. And when it comes to expressions, when it comes to 2D animation, it's honestly a lot easier than you would think. And the way I'm going to explain or express this, I'm going to make a drawing. Give me 1 minute to find a pen. So with 3D animation, you have to go through this entire modeling process where you have to create a character and force them into all these different types of positions, all these different models. You have to physically go through and change how they look every time. But when it comes to 2D if I can find a pen that works. Where are all my working pens? That's like 4. All right, well, that one's working. But all right. All right. But with 2D animation, you can make something as simple as a smiley face. You could tell it's smiling, even though my drawing's not as good. And in order to change his expression, all you need are lines. So I'm going to add 2 lines right there. And you can tell that the smiley face is tired. They're smiling, but it's tired. Flip it to the other side. We'll do the same thing. Smiley face. And now it's a smug smiley face. Just from adding an eyebrow. See, where 3D expressions, you have to manipulate the entire face to make it look how it is. With 2D animation, all you have to do is add a couple lines. Which is why I would argue that emotions, like expressing emotions with 2D animation, is a lot easier than expressing emotions in 3D animation.
I can certainly agree with you on that aspect, but let's keep in mind, both 3D and 2D have their constraints when you think about like how difficult it is to pull certain facial expressions off. I mean, with 2D animation, everything has to be drawn out frame by frame. For the most part, especially back in the day when you literally did have to draw everything out.
Yeah.
And with 3D animation, sure, you're probably not drawing everything out. However, you still have to go on to like whatever animation software you're working with and just move each frame subtly.
Well, the thing with 2D animation though is, and this is actually something that has been explained through a bunch of different movies and series, not just in the past, but even in the present day, with the show Invincible in mind. Artists will do certain things as a way to make animating cheaper or easier. Sometimes this will mean they'll have a wide shot instead of a close-up shot where no one's really moving, but there's still talking going on. And in a scene where someone's talking, they'll cover the mouth but keep the facial expression. So you can see them and you think they're talking, but it's just the same single page. Or you might where someone's talking little like this. If I'm talking like this, you can hear I'm talking. I'm not really moving though. Animators will do something like that for 2D animation as a way to not have to draw every single thing.
You did move, but your camera certainly did when you turned around.
I could tell. I could tell. Regardless, animators understand that they have to get every single frame. So they have all these tips and tricks on how to change that. Like I said, all those examples came from the TV series Invincible. The other thing that they will do is they will draw the models of the characters outside of the backgrounds, which you could see in a bunch of DC animated movies. And the only way you can see it is because the backgrounds are different art styles than the characters. But at the same time, you'll have it where they draw something like that, where they don't have to go and redraw everything over and over again. They just have to redraw the model of the character over and over again, but use the same background.
Yeah, well, that's the thing too. The flaw with 2D animation is that even when you're trying to work around some of those limitations and try to not use as many of those model sheets as possible, you still can't pull that off all the time, depending
No,
on the length of time that you're dealing with. Um, but that brings me to something I want to bring up when it comes to 3D animation is that you make a model,
mhm.
it there are not usually that many changes that you have to make. It's not like, oh, you have all these separate models of like the same characters that are just wearing the same clothes and they're just doing different poses. No, you put the model in there and you're able to manipulate it the way that you want to. And this just doesn't go for like characters. It also goes for buildings and landscapes too, or just simple objects. Uh, but but this does bring me up to something because this is where I bring games
Mhm.
into the picture because and this kind of goes along with the point of like depth that I was talking about is that whether it comes to a movie or a game, you know, the amount of depth that goes to creating like a 3D landscape can be surreal sometimes. I mean, think about this. Would The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild be what it is if it was a 2D game? And I'm actually mentioning this because when they made Breath of the Wild, they made it a 2D game at first because they were trying to build it upon the philosophy of the original Legend of Zelda of like, oh, you could go wherever you want to.
Mhm.
But the limitations of the original Legend of Zelda, besides it being a 2D game, is the fact that there's only so much that you could show in one plane. You know, sure, you may be traversing like different areas, but there's only so much that you could show.
Mhm.
When it comes to something like Breath of the Wild, you know, you're seeing everything in this perspective. And sure, you may be looking up or down with like freeway movement because every 3D game has to have a camera control. Um, the the thing about it is just like you can't see where that next frame is going to take you. You can't see like I mean, sure, you could look at to the distance of like, oh, where this thing could be at, but it's just like, oh, how do I get there? Oh, let's find out. Or I check this out and see what it is. It's hard to pull that off in a 2D
Mhm.
landscape.
Right, but the thing with a 2D landscape, and I'm gonna bring up Legend of Zelda as well, because I feel like Legend of Zelda followed this sort of format. Because it's 2D, you see everything that is around you going towards you. Like in regards to Legend of Zelda, you had four cardinal directions, which means if you had any enemies, they had to come from those four cardinal directions. In Mario, you had that 2D form, but you only had enemies coming from those two directions, from you and behind you. When you have a 3D form, like a three-dimensional game like Breath of the Wild or Mario Odyssey, you can have an enemy going from all angles, even angles that are off camera. So
Mhm.
at a certain point, you could be walking and all of a sudden get attacked from off screen, and now you have to go and manipulate where you're looking just to try and find where that character is or where that enemy happens to be. Same thing when it comes to puzzles. If you're taking part in a puzzle in a game, a 2D game is going to have the puzzle roughly in front of you, and if not, they'll have its own separate room for you to solve the puzzle. For a 3D game, you have to look at every possible detail just to find out the answer to the puzzle. So this will make puzzles harder. And then the last thing, yes, you get more range when you have a 3D game. But the problem is if your game is centered on getting from point A to point B, having that sort of range is a lot harder to get from point A to point B because again, you got all these different directions you can go in And if you don't have a map up or you don't know where you're going, it is a lot easier to get lost. Meanwhile, in a 2D game, again, original Legend of Zelda with the four cardinal directions, you can go one way for a certain point, say, oh, made a wrong turn somewhere, go back and try it again. It's like
Hmm.
the difference between going through a maze on a piece of paper or going through a maze, like a corn maze in real life. On a piece of
Hmm.
paper, you can see everywhere you need to go, so you can go in those directions. Whereas in a corn maze, you're physically in the corn maze. You have to take every turn with caution.
Yeah. Those are great points to bring up. Um, but because you mentioned Mario, I do want to bring in an example of like where they took a 3D space and the real estate was changed. Because when you're mentioning like enemies coming from behind you and not being able to see, sure, that's a valid argument if you're talking about Super Mario 64 or Mario Sunshine or even Super Mario Odyssey.
Mhm.
But take Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, for example. Those are 3D games, and yet they have a different perspective change because the whole concept of the game is that you're walking around planets. And in order to show those planets, they kind of have to view it out a little bit. I mean, sure, there are points where like you're in that 3D plane and you're looking from behind the character, but most of the time you're actually looking from the top and you're able to traverse the real estate of the planets, which is something that is hard to pull off in a 2D space, at least to make it look smooth. Um, and then the other Super Mario 3D World, like any of like those 3D games where they handle like a 2D game, those are kind of handled in that same, not in the same perspective because you're not traversing planets. In fact, they play more like 2D Mario games than traditional open world 3D Mario games. There is a point A and a point B, but you're not necessarily getting blocked by enemies from behind you, where you get sneak attacked from behind. Um, but that also brings up another point too. Most 3D games, um, some of them do have like a point A and a point B to go to. But the thing is that most 3D games usually provide pretty good maps. And if they don't, like in the case of Super Mario 64, like that's kind of like a choose your own venture. Because in that game, it's like, sure, you could find defeat the boss and get a star that way, or you could take down this chain chomp, which would break the gate, which does have a star inside of it. And there you go. And like the whole game is like that. Most of the 3D Mario games are like that, where they're just kind of like those choose your own adventure type of deals. And that's the same. That's the same thing with Breath of the Wild too. Breath of the Wild is a choose your own adventure. It's like you don't have to conquer the first shrine. You could just go on and fight Ganon. And people have done that. There are videos online of people doing that.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, that's all I could think of right now.
But see, the thing is, when you have that happen, you lose the essence of the game. Yes, video games, your goal is to complete the game. But most good games, in order to complete the game, you have to go through trials. You gotta go through your own difficulties. Take, for example, the Odyssey from Odysseus. Not a video game, but more a story. In the Odyssey, after the Trojan War, Odysseus has to go home. But on his way home, he has to go through a bunch of monsters, different islands with gods and magic. Even going so far as to losing his entire crew and getting stranded on an island. What are you doing?
I'm trying to pretend to drown. It's hard to do it on this chair.
Yeah. But that's the point of the journey. It's showing perseverance. It is saying, hey, life is going to be difficult. You have to be the one to battle through it and get to your destination, which in the end of the Odyssey, he does. Granted, it takes him 20 years, and it shows just how big his and his wife's love is for each other, because they were both faithful the entire time. But at the same time, the Odyssey wouldn't be such an iconic story without the the trials, the mishaps, the obstacles he has to overcome. Now, you take that free world game, you no longer have the trial. And in the case of Breath of the Wild, you could just automatically go to the boss. But where's the lesson? Where's the overcoming obstacles? In a lot of games, in order for you to beat the boss, you have to go get these or complete these missions, get level ups, get these weapons. But in an open world game where you could just go and fight the boss and just grind, sure, that's its own trial, but you're missing the point of the game. The game isn't just to complete it, it's complete it going through everything that the hero needs to go through. You're Odysseus, and you're trying to have your Odyssey
Mhm.
in a video game where you could just speed run it by just hanging to the boss right away. You lose the essence of the game where you lose the fun. And I admit, you know, for some games, I'd rather just go through, get them done. As someone who doesn't play a lot of video games. But for me, the iconic moments are when you play the in-depth, level formats, when you go through each obstacle. Because every time you go through that obstacle, you get better and better every time. You're training your mind. You're training your thumbs or fingers or whatever you use
Mhm.
get better. And that's what video games are supposed to be doing. Instead of just giving you a mindless entertainment, they're training you in a way
Mhm.
that we don't normally get trained.
Well, the thing is, it's just like that depends on who's designing the game. Because sure, in Breath of the Wild, you could defeat the boss if you wanted to and not explore the whole adventure, but that was a choice purposefully done by the designers. You know what was also purposefully done by the designers? Let's go back to Super Mario 64, where you can't fight Bowser unless you have a certain amount of stars. There's 120 stars to collect, but you only need to collect 70. And that's the case for most 3D Mario games, except for Mario Odyssey, where you have power moons and there's over like 500 of them, but you only need like a fraction of those in order to fight Bowser. Um, that's a choice by the designers.
Mhm.
And that's dependent on the fact of whether they want to do that or not. I will admit, like sometimes it doesn't go over super well. But again, that depends on how purposeful the designers are. In the case of Nintendo, I think most of the time they're pretty thoughtful in terms of like the goals that they want to reach in terms of their games. You know, Breath of the Wild was made to be an open world game where you could do whatever the heck you want. And that is the case also with Super Mario 64, but that's more about like, oh, how do I get to this obstacle? Because it's like, this is the other thing too. In a 3D space, this also applies for animation too. You're able to do movements that you couldn't easily do in a 2D space. Like, if we were to compare 2D Mario to 3D Mario, like 2D Mario, he could jump. In some games, he could spin or fly. And then in newer 2D Mario games, he does have stuff like the double and triple jump. And sure, 3D Mario could also do those things, but he could also do backflips. He could do like frickin' cartwheels. Super Mario 64 break dances as one of his attacking moves. can't easily do that in a 2D plane. Um, Although that is dependent on the control options too, which every game takes that into consideration too. Um, but there's a lot of real estate to work with here, like climbing up walls or uh, trying to find different ways to traverse the level, and that's something that you know 3D animators are able to do. And again, you could do that in a 2D plane, but again, there's that frame by frame possibility that you're talking about.
Hmm.
In a 3D space, it's just that one model that you have to deal with. And sure, yes, you do have to make sure the camera is at the right spot and the view is at the right angle. Maybe you have to do like a little world view camera sort of deal, but that's easier to do in a 3D plane than it is in a 2D plane.
Okay. So I'll agree with that. But there's something else that I want to bring up, and I feel like this is something to bring up a little more when it comes to movies and TV shows over games, but it's the price. Generally speaking, 2D animation is cheaper than 3D animation. It's the difference between hiring artists who are working, you know, multiple days, couple week or multiple weeks, sometimes even multiple months to do what they love to do and draw versus hiring not just computer and or computer animators, but you gotta hire the software and the hardware, or you gotta pay for the hardware and software. You've gotta have everything fine-tuned to a specific thing. Statistically, 2D animation costs approximately 5,000 to 200 ah 5,000 to $25,000 per minute, which sounds expensive. I couldn't pay that per minute. But when you compare it to 3D animation, 3D animation is 15,000 to 50,000 or even a lot more to do because you're using a lot more technology, you're using a lot more power just to complete it. For 2D animation, I can do it just about anywhere. I can grab my trusty pen, grab my notebook, except for this isn't my trusty pen because it died. Uh, but you could grab your trusty pen and notebook and you could draw just about anywhere. You can physically move wherever you want to go and draw it. If you need to take stuff home, you can take stuff home without having or without needing a flash drive or some sort of software to connect from your work computer to your home computer. 3D animation, however, you're kind of confined to behind a screen. And then, above all else, when it comes to 2D animation, generally speaking, yes, because it's 2D and you're doing more this, or in some cases, you are drawing on computer. But when it comes to physical models, you've got the physical thing where if you're doing both physical and the digital happens to cut out, you still have a backup. You have multiple options for a backup. But when you do a 3D, when you're working with 3D, working with 3D models, if something wrong happens and your project is deleted, you've got to go back and redo it from scratch. That was almost the case for Toy Story 2. Because initially, Toy Story 2, it was almost done, and then I think it was 90% of the movie got deleted. And everyone was panicking because you had to either you have to start from scratch, which is going to make the movie a lot more expensive, or you have to scrap it, which means you just spent whatever money you used on nothing. Luckily, there was a nice lady who had a backup, but still, when it comes to 2D animation, the resources, you don't have to start from scratch on an expensive level or on as an expensive level. 3D animation, you have to have more expense. or it does make it a little more expensive.
That is certainly true. However, um, even though it can be a different case for 2D animation, they still have to put up through that. I mean,
They
two,
do, but
two,
it's not
two,
to the same
two,
extreme.
but yeah, but to this day, though, um, I look up developer interviews for people that made 2D games back in the day, and there's like, oh, this game went through a hard drive crash, so we had to make the game from scratch, or like um
Hmm.
or something like that. But that's less of a an animation issue and it's more of a technology issue, which is something that happens no matter what.
Right, but what I'm saying is with 2D animation, you don't just have to rely on technology. You can rely on other forms. You can rely on a notepad. You can rely on, yeah, you can rely on technology. Honestly, if you're desperate enough, you could rely on yarn and bring that
Yeah.
because there's a specific game that came out recently that follows a more 2D format where everything was knitted rather than drawn.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, 3D animation kind of has or will have to stick with digital because all of the models are in a digital world. So if the internet happens to crash or you happen to lose internet, you've lost the project, whether it's temporary or permanent.
I do have one question to bring up though, and that is because there's two, generally speaking, there are two different types of whether it's movies, games, or shows, there are two groups that you deal with,
Hmm.
which is the big guys. So, like in the case of movies, it's like Disney and Disney. I'm kidding.
Disney.
Disney or Sony or and I'm counting Disney as like the Marvel and the Lucasfilm and all that.
Right.
Um, but you got Disney, you got Sony, you got all those other guys. And then you also have Nintendo and Sony again, and Microsoft with Xbox as well. But you got that, you got the big boys,
Hmm.
and then you got the little guys, which are the indie guys. People that make independent movies and people that make independent games too. And sometimes they have to form their own studio in order to do that.
Yes.
Um, but my question is, and I'm asking you specifically because I may not be remembering this, but when was the last time a big studio, not an independent studio, a big studio made a 2D, a traditional 2D movie where they
Um,
used like no 3D modeling whatsoever in order to make the landscapes or the models or anything?
so give me 1 second, because all right. So now that I see that, I'm gonna quickly hop onto IMDb, and you're going to hate yourself once I say this.
Mm-hmm.
Technically, when it comes to like a big, well-known movie that ended up winning awards, the last big 2D drawn movie was The Boy and the Heron from 2023, made by Studio Ghibli, which is
Okay.
still a big studio.
It is still a big studio. And I'll admit they are very committed into doing they're one of the few big studios that still does like hand-drawn 2D stuff, which
Hmm.
I love for the record, but that's not the point. But Studio Ghibli is in Japan. It is in Japan, and they're not that
Well,
associated
you
with
didn't
America.
ask about specific places. You just asked in general When was the last time a
I,
big movie was released in 2D? You never
yeah, but
you
they're
never
still.
specified specific places.
I
You
know,
being
but like
racist,
wait, when
Jake?
you think about bigger studios, most of the
Studio
big
Ghibli is a big studio.
it is. Let me finish. It is a big studio, which its primary place of operation is in Japan, and while they may have other places of business in other countries because there's distributors and whatnot. Um, but well, actually, their distributors are usually people of separate studios that handle and importing stuff like that. Um, but most of the bigger studios like Sony and Disney and Universal, they're primarily in America. And while they do have divisions in other countries, that's not their main in-house studio.
Okay, well, since you want to take a more
I still think it's a valid argument. I'm just saying
no, you're
that
twisting your words so that you can get your way. I see
no,
how it is.
no,
But
I am still I'm
technically speaking, 2015, Nickelodeon released the SpongeBob movie Sponge Out of Water. So technically, it's been 11 years because you don't want to count Studio Ghibli and their Marvel. So let's just stick with American works. SpongeBob, Sponge Out of Water, 2015. That was the last big one that came out. But
yeah, but that
there
was
have been
primarily a
rumors.
3D movie. That
What's
was
that?
primarily that was primarily a 3D
That
movie.
was
Well,
not
it didn't.
primarily a 3D movie. They had a lot.
What?
No, they had a 3D element, but it was still a 2D movie because there was a live action element to it.
There was a live out action element to it. I'm not. I'll be fair. I did not see the movie. I've only seen like clips and commercials of the film. So guess it's not that valid. But my
No,
whole
but like I
point.
said, when you change how you're asking the question, that's when everything becomes a little more towards you. But you asked me specifically, what was the big or last big movie from a big studio that was in 2D animation? It was The Boy and the Heron, which won an Academy. Was it an Academy Award or was it an Emmy? Hold on.
It'd be some type of award because Studio Ghibli movies usually rank that high, and plus it was a
Boy
Hayao Miyazaki film specifically.
Award. It won the Academy Award for Best Animated Film, which means it went up against what other 2023 animated films? I feel like there's a big one. It went up against Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and won. It went up against Elemental, went up against Super Mario Bros. Movie. It went up against Nimona, which was actually a pretty good movie, and I feel like needs a lot more attention. Oh, you want to what? You want to know a big studio that still makes animated films that is American, Jake? Warner Brothers. They don't release it in theaters, but they still make 2D animated DC films. They make 2D animated Mortal Kombat films, and they still release those. And they still get a lot of hype because of the amount of fan base Warner Brothers has.
That is fair.
And
Um,
here's the other thing. When you think of cartoons, not necessarily movies, but cartoon TV shows, what were some of the big cartoons of our lives?
are we talking about like in our lifetime or?
Our lifetime. Because our lifetime's still technically within this lifetime.
Well, I mean, we were just talking about Ben 10 in our
Ben 10.
previous
What was
episode.
Ben 10? Was Ben 10 2D or 3D?
It was primarily 2D.
Primarily 2D. How about Generator Rex? Because we were also talking a little bit about that. 2D or
Also
3D?
primarily, also primarily 2D.
Mhm. Let's go to Disney. What about the Disney Marvel shows? Were they 2D or 3D? Your Ultimate Spider-Man, your Earth's Mightiest Heroes.
Okay, I see your point.
No, 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 no. How about Phineas and Ferb, which is getting an or which has a new season out? Is that 2D or
Mhm.
3D, Jake?
Um, I think that was like 2D.
That was 2D. And we can't even say that 2D's gone out because they're still making they're still making stuff with that. You know what else is still making episodes and is about to get a second season after its revival, I want to say last year?
Was it the Amazing World Gumball?
It was not. The Amazing World of Gumball is 3D.
No, it's a mix of 2D and 3D.
It's
It's called the Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball now. I've just been seeing clips of the show. It's actually pretty good.
no, no. I'm talking about something from the 90s that came back and is still following the 2D animated style.
Is that X-Men?
It is X-Men. X-Men 97 still follows a 2D format. And it's not just that. Disney also released it's Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, which I'll admit does take some 3D elements, but primarily the character models are in a 2D form. So it still heavily follows 2D animation. So trying to make the argument that 3D is more relevant than 2D is invalid because 2D still holds a lot of relevancy in TV shows. Still holds a lot of relevancy when it comes to Warner Brothers because they release a bunch of their DC War Combat stuff outside of the live action movies in 2D animation and still holds relevance in Studio Ghibli, which is a big production company. It doesn't matter that they are not from the United States. They are all, they still have impact all around the world. That is like saying, oh, we're from Japan, but we're not going to factor Disney in because they're primarily American. No, Jake, if we're doing this, we're going global.
I
We are going
I'm not
global with this
making
argument.
I'm not making the argument that Studio Ghibli isn't a
You
important
were.
studio. They
You were, because I
are.
brought up Studio Ghibli and they're like, oh, that doesn't count. They're in Japan.
I didn't say it
You
didn't
did.
count.
I may be
No.
paraphrasing, but that
I
is basically what you said that got me into this rant. You want to play like that? We're playing like that.
I do not, because you brought up the fact that some 2D stuff is like still has blended 3D elements in it. That's one thing. The other thing to take into consideration too is those shows. Because like again, I'm not as fine tuned to like some of the people that develop these type of things because again, you got producers and then you got the developers.
Mhm.
And it's a debate of whether those type of projects are made in-house in studio or not. Of course, Studio Ghibli is the big exception to that rule because they still make hand-drawn 2D movies. But Disney, like, did they like if we were to take, for example, the Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man as an example, was it Disney's idea to have something like that, or was it a developer from outside of like the realm of Disney and they had to go to Disney?
It was Disney.
It was Disney's idea?
It was Disney's idea.
Were they the
Disney's
ones
going back
to?
to 2D animation. In fact, right now they're in a funk, and at the current rate of trend with how their movies have been, we can easily see them going back to 2D animated movies.
That'd be a sight to behold.
Well,
um,
it's
but
something we
but
behold.
but even then, it's like they can people can't entirely escape the realm of 3D animation, though. Even in a 2D plane, I mean, some of the more recent movies, especially the ones that have trended pretty hard, like if we were to take the Spider-Verse movies as an example, they're a blend of like 3D and 2D animation right there.
Yes, but here's the other thing you gotta factor in. Time. How long has it been since we had Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse
That was like 3 years ago.
3 years ago. They are still working on Beyond the Spider-Verse. In fact, Beyond the Spider-Verse is going through development hell because there's so much technical stuff going on with it. It's the same
Yeah,
as
but
the Avatar movies. All the Avatar movies took so long to make because the technology is still developing,
mhm.
which is why 3D animation isn't as consistent.
That's also depends on how big your scope is.
It
You
does
know.
depend on how big your scope is, but at the same time, because the technology is constantly improving and getting more expensive, it leaves 3D to be more inconsistent. 2D animation, however, because it follows the artist rather than just the technology. Sure, the artist's art can improve throughout the entire duration of the work, but the art can still follow the the art will still follow the movie. It's not like things are going to be changing within the movie to change the or change the overall CGI, computer generated 3D stuff.
Mhm.
The animation is artist rendering.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, guess what? I forgot a couple other 2D things that are very relevant. Because guess what? Invincible, which I already mentioned earlier, that's 2D.
It's getting a fourth season.
It is getting a fourth season, but that's 2D. That is Prime. That is Amazon
Mhm.
Prime. You know what else I believe is Amazon Prime? That just got a second season, and I think they're working on a third season right now.
Mhm.
Has Been Hotel.
Right.
And I also want to bring up some longevity because, granted, it's not, this argument might not be as fair because 3D animation is still fairly new compared to 2D animation. But when you have a 3D animated work, again, there's going to be changes to it, but there's not going to be as much of a longevity because of those changes. Whenever you have a 3D animated series, it may go for a couple seasons, but it's going to be.
Mhm.
It's not like The Simpsons that is on season, and I'm going to go double check this because I looked it up while
Oh
you.
my gosh, the longevity of like the Simpsons and Family Guy is just like it's just too much.
The Simpsons started in 1989, which I mean, thinking about this, I think that's the same time when computer generated movies started getting a little more attention. It has been running for 37 seasons and is still going strong. We've also got, and you're gonna hate this one because this is one you talk about all the time, King of the Hill, which has 14 seasons and is recently getting a reboot. Or no, the 14th season just came out on Hulu.
Yeah, it's not a reboot.
No,
It's not a reboot. Straight
not
up
necessarily
continue.
reboot, but you know what I mean. We've also got once I look it up, we've also got Family Guy, which has been running for 24 seasons and still going strong.
Eh,
We've got Beavis and Butthead, which recently got a little revival on Paramount Plus.
that's probably the one show I don't want to see return, to be honest. That the fact that that show returned still befuddles me because like that show was so controversial back in the day.
You
And
know,
sure, you could.
you know another show that was controversial? South Park, which is still going strong, and they're actually making movies as well.
Yeah, that is true. But South Park is more clever though.
South Park is clever. You know how clever they are? They're a great example of cutting corners when it comes to animation. Because the original, I'm not sure if they still do that, but the original series had it where when people were talking, instead of it being right making multiple models, they made like one, maybe two models, depending on arm shape, and it had where
Mhm.
the heads moved up and down as they were talking. But again, all those shows are 2D animated, and they're still going strong because you can keep that consistency. Meanwhile, we're getting a Toy Story 5. If you look at the difference in animation style between Toy Story and Toy Story 5, there is such a drastic difference in look that it's honestly sickening.
That is true. But it also comes into the question of more like how timeless can something be? Because let's be honest, whether it's 2D or 3D, it's not just about how good your art style is also how timeless your story is. And like there are people that still hold the first Toy Story even as like something to behold, even to this day. And yes, I will make the camp of it, being outdated. You know what doesn't feel outdated though? Veggie Tales. Those earlier episodes from like the 90s and early 2000s are still like some of the best things in terms of animation and storyboarding that like still holds up to this day.
Hmm.
And to say this, again, um 2D and 3Ds stuff, whether it comes to games or movies or shows, they still have to create convincing stories, and not every animation style is always going to be held to a high regard. Sure, there may have been a big 2D movie that got hyped up, but then got shelved, which happened to a lot of 2D movies, especially during the early 2000s. But the same thing has happened to like 3D as well. But to cap this all off, the big knock against 2D and 3D is that you still got models to deal with, some of which you have to store on a computer. The alternative to all that, though, that we've not discussed at this point,
What? What's the alternative?
stop motion.
I want to keep that out because stop motion is its own separate thing.
Yeah, it is a separate thing. It is a separate
I
thing.
feel like that I feel like that on its own could be a topic because there's so many different ways you can have stop motion.
Yeah, and they're still making stop motion movies. It's just that a lot of them don't gain popular traction. And like I'm trying to think because I remember the last time I saw a new stop motion movie was Del Toro's Pinocchio, which I didn't see the whole thing of, and I still want to watch that movie because oh my gosh, is that thing gorgeous? Like, oh, and you talk about something like there are still stop motion projects that still look timeless to this day. There are still people that go watch those stop motion Christmas movies that we all grew up with, with, you know, St. Nicholas or Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
I was gonna
Um,
fight you if you weren't gonna say Rudolph.
um, yeah. But here's the thing, though. As much as I've been defending 3D animation, trying my best anyways, I am an advocate for more so 2D.
Hmm.
I honestly do think that 2D ages the best. Now, that's not to say I don't dislike 3D. In fact, I like both. I
Hmm.
like both. I like both 2D and 3D games. It just depends on how they're handled. You know, Something I didn't bring up to this point was just like, you mentioned 2D being easier, but there was I keep talking about wanting to do the Nintendo retrospective, which is still on the cards. I just haven't done anything with it yet. But Nintendo had a problem during the 3DS. Well, it actually started way earlier, like in the DS and Wii era, but it became more of a problem when we got to the Wii U and 3DS, where Nintendo published a lot of 2D games.
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, some of them were pretty good. You know, you had Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze. You got Yoshi's Woolly World, Super Mario Maker. But you also had the new Super Mario Brothers games. You had a bunch of 2D Zelda games and Kirby games and all this different stuff. But a lot of them just melded into each other, and it became this thing for a while where it's just like Nintendo publishes nothing but 2D games, and even their 3D stuff, like we mentioned with Mario 3D World, you know, that has 2D elements to it with like flagpole and such. So it was kind of seen as like this. It didn't feel like a creative decision for a while. It felt like, oh, let's just make 2D games because they're easier. But again, that's where 3D games come into play. Yes, 3D games generally do have more of a budget. And the knock against 3D games, and because like I kept mentioning Nintendo, but this is a problem. This has become a problem right now in the games industry the past couple of years with Xbox and Sony and other developers that are affiliated with them. Is like you take a look at Grand Theft Auto or The Witcher or Red Dead Redemption or Final Fantasy, games that aim for the realistic looking humanoid models and textures and landscapes and forests and mountains and whatever. It's all become homogenous now. And that's a bigger knock for Final Fantasy, because Final Fantasy was a series that tried to push boundaries when it came to technical prowess and art style. It used to have its own distinct look, but now it just kind of melds in because there are people that chase the trends of what the AAA developers are doing. Right. And I think it's slowly getting to that point where, like, I think studios are trying to pull back now. Similar with movies, they're trying to pull back and make more double A stuff where you have less of a budget, less people to deal with, because this is a big problem with movies and games, like the AAA developers specifically. Huge production team, huge, massive, hundreds, maybe thousands of people you have to work with. It's all become too much. And sure, there are some studios that can't pull it off, but for how long? For how long? And when should we have to scale back? Like, there are still game developers to this day, like Atlas, or I'm trying to think of Yoko Taro's studio, but like Persona 5 was a generally 2D game with some 3D assets, but like they had a small budget and a small team, and they were able to pull something that made a lot of money back. And then Nier Automata, which is the opposite, that's more of a 3D game, that made a ton of money. For a while, like even years after the game came out, it still sold like 1 million each year. It's like incredible. But yeah, that is to say, like, I think 2D and 3D, they both have flaws, but they both have strengths. And I don't think it should be the case of like, oh, 2D needs to be more relevant again. I mean, don't get me wrong. I would love to see a 2D movie. I still want to see 3D games, not 3D games, 2D games. But that's not to say that we shouldn't keep 3D out of the discussion. And as we've mentioned several times, you know, whether it's movies or games or TV shows, there are a lot of 2D stuff, shows, movies, and games where they have a mix of 3D elements in them.
Right.
So it shows the marriage between those art styles. And it kind of shows that like, you know, there can be a balance to be met. And I don't think it should be the case of like, we need to entirely go back to 2D or we need to make 3D be our only thing, you know?
See, only Siths deal in absolutes. I feel like what's going to make us stronger as a community is instead of focusing on solely change, we need to focus on adapting. Where, cool, we have 2D animation and we have 3D animation. We can fuse the two together. Maybe we could try having it interchangeable, have some things 2D, some things 3D, not heavily rely on either or.
Yeah. And Nintendo was starting to get back on that trend with like the Switch era with their own games because sure, they published a very big 3D Mario game, Super Mario Odyssey. And then they also released the 3D World re-release with Bowser's Fury, which that went out super well. But they made a new 2D Mario game that was not the new Super Mario Brothers style. It was Super Mario Brothers Wonder. It had its own unique art style, and it's like one of the best-selling Switch games now. Like, uh, I'm not sure if it's best-selling than like some of the new Super Mario Brothers titles like DS and Wii.
Mhm.
Although I like it to be because it's got a unique art style and its own thing going on. But like it shows that like, you know, 2D just needs to be balanced out with 3D.
Mhm.
And like and Kirby, Kirby was primarily a 2D franchise for a while, but then Forgotten Land came out, which that was a 3D game, and it's held up pretty well. Um, and then we got examples of like two Metroid games, one being pretty good with Metroid Dread on Switch, and then the most recent one, Metroid Prime 4, which is okay. It was okay.
Yep.
And you talk about long development cycles. Metroid Prime 4, that was like from 2017 to 2025. Like, holy crap, that game took a while to develop. Speaking of that, though,
Mhm.
and this was a case I wanted to bring up earlier, but like, now this is more of an indie studio than anything, but like, you remember Cuphead?
I do remember Cuphead.
Cuphead took like in order for that game to be completed and released, like the developers had to mortgage their own houses
Ugh.
for that game to come out. And what happened? It sold pretty well, and it even got DLC, which came out. I think it was 6 years later, 6 or 5 years later. It took a while, but
All right.
that was mainly like 2D written, drawn art style and everything with using those old techniques from the early 20th century.
Mhm. Yep. All right. Now, on my end, I agree with Jake. I prefer 2D animated. I know this is kind of circling back, but I prefer 2D animated films, but I do have a soft spot for 3D animation. Again, I'm a nerd, specifically a sci-fi nerd. So when I see something ad a good advancement in technology or a good advancement, I mean, I guess like a good advancement in technology or a good advancement in science, I like that or the idea of it. It's why I have a love-hate relationship with James Cameron right now, the guy who made the Avatar movies.
Mm,
On the one hand, I'm gonna be honest, and this is gonna cause a lot of hate for me.
mhm,
I'm not as big of a fan of the newer Avatar movies as I was with the original.
mm,
Feel like they're just, I feel like he's story-wise sort of recycling a bunch of ideas and concepts just to make elongated movies. But where I hate him in that regard, I love all that he's been doing for cinematography and for, yeah, well, mainly cinematography, but he's also been doing a lot of work when it comes to oceanography.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who don't know, James Cameron was also a big advocate for the ocean. He specifically funded a trip to the Titanic so that he could film Titanic. Ever since then, he's been funding all sorts of things, including making a specific camera or a specific camera lens to film wonderfully underwater. But like I said, I have a soft spot for 3D because I'm a nerd. I like technological advancements. And
Mm-hmm.
I like when both 2D and 3D mesh well together. However, if you were to ask me what type of film I would prefer, I'd prefer to watch a 2D film. Right. And I believe that ends our argument, Jake.
I believe so. I mean, I would go to see a big 2D film again. I mean, I'm a big advocate for Studio Ghibli. I mean, heck,
I know that's why
one
I
of
brought
my
up
favorite
the point
movies
here.
of all time is a freaking Studio Ghibli movie.
I
And
know.
they are so committed, for better or for worse, to sticking with that 2D art style.
Hmm.
Like they don't really cut any corners. You know, those movies take a while to come out. But that's also one of the beautiful things about that studio is just like, you know, they come out and it feels like the right time for it to come out.
Now, if only we could get more animated Marvel movies. Come on,
That'd
Marvel.
be
Gotta
that'd be
pick up your
sick.
slack. We had Planet Hulk. Now make World War Hulk. Please. I'm begging you. This is an itch I haven't been able to scratch in years.
I mean, come on. DC is still making like 2D films.
They are.
Give us a Batman Beyond film. Where is it, Warner Brothers?
They scrapped it. They scrapped it.
Mm.
They originally had it, and then they scrapped it. Same with the Batgirl movie that they were going to come out with.
There was supposed to be a Batgirl
There was supposed to
movie.
be a no. It's not just that. There was supposed to be a Batgirl movie where Brendan Fraser was the main villain,
Ooh,
the guy from The Mummy.
I've not seen the Mummy.
All right, that's all we have for this episode. I'm gonna go slam my head on a wall somewhere because of that. Jake, one of these days we're gonna have a movie night so that we could watch Brendan Fraser's The Mummy.
Oh
You'll like it.
man.
You're gonna learn why deep down Brendan Fraser should have been a Superman. Well, with that being said, I'm Xavier Dean,
Yeah, I'm Jacob Green.
wishing you a wonderful night. Please watch a movie. Like, I don't care if it's 3D animated, 2D animated, or live action. Just please watch a movie and watch it for enjoyment. Don't just watch it to find a deeper meaning, because honestly, a lot of movies don't really have a deeper meaning these days.
Yeah.
We will see you next week for another episode. Have a wonderful night.